Hello and welcome everyone to Season 4 of Contact's Produce Safety Webinar Series. We are so grateful to see you in 20. As a reminder, this series is part of a larger industry outreach and risk mitigation project called Contact, or scientific challenges and cost-effective management of risks associated with implementation of produce safety. It's supported by the USDA Specialty Crops Research Initiative. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So who is Contact? It's many universities and government institutions that make up the Contact team, about over 50 faculty, staff, students, and volunteers, not to mention our Produce Advisory Committee. It takes a village and you're part of it. We are very appreciative to each of the individual support and ongoing efforts to make Contact a grant championed by you all. Contact is also in its final year. So as we prep for Contact 2.0, please let us know if there are things that you would like to see. Also, if you'd like to join our Produce Advisory Committee, please send us an email as well. We wanted to make everyone aware that every single webinar that we have had presented on our Contact webinar series over the 4 seasons is available to watch on our YouTube page. You can Google Produce Safety Science. Hopefully it'll pop up. You can also subscribe to be able to get notifications of when new webinars are dropped or other educational content. But those are freely available. We also wanted to make note, and we will be sharing all of these soon, some of our research summaries. So for every single Contact objective, there's a series of peer-reviewed publications that have been coming out based on the science and the data that's been generated. We decided also to develop these small one-page research notes that are available in a PDF form that provide a high-level overview with key results, as well as accessibility to that publication. We also developed the PowerPoint decks that go with that publication that expand on the one-pager with slide notes. And they're all very short, less than 10 slides. And these will be freely available too to anybody, but all of our educators, folks in industry that are using some of this as training programs. We did want to make this note, and they will be available. They'll be also available in Spanish as well, that we are working on currently. Here's just a short look at what some of them look like. But again, nice high-level overview with the key findings, a QR code to go and visit that research publication more in depth, as well as some of the slide decks expand on some of those key concepts a little more. One last thing before we get to why we're all here. Betsy Bihn, but I wanted to have a save the date for March 27th. We will be continuing to expand on water, but this time all about post-harvest water. We'll be continuing our research to reality segment. The Objective 4 of Contact's big grant was all about post-harvest water, but we'll be joined by some of the team to really dive into that from a practical, taking that research to reality. So stay tuned, March 27th, 2025. Okay, so why we're all here today? We are going to wade into the science of agricultural water with Dr. Betsy Bihn, who is a fantastic educator, scientist, and also colleague and friend. Betsy is a senior extension associate in the Department of Food Science at Cornell. She's currently the director of the Produce Safety Alliance and the National Good Agricultural Practices Program. Got her degrees from Cornell, Florida, and the Ohio State. Betsy, I will turn it over to you. The floor is yours, and we're all very excited to hear your talk today.
Thanks so much, Laura. I really appreciate it. I'm not doing my own bio. I want to thank the Contact Group for the opportunity to present today. And I also want to thank all of you for taking the time to either be on this call or perhaps watch the recording. Time is the most valuable asset we have, so I really appreciate that. In putting this together, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make this the most valuable to those who might be watching. There's a lot of people registered for this call, and it became increasingly difficult to figure that out. My goals for today is to give everyone on this call at least one new thing to think about and given the diversity of the expertise and experiences to hopefully either confirm what you were thinking some of the science said, or maybe give you a question to follow up with newer references that might be of value. So, what are the value and challenges when it comes to the science for that strawberry? All right. Yep. So that's why we're here today. First, I want to talk about the values and challenges when we talk about produce safety and the science that hinges on it. I really truly believe, and this might be a little bit controversial in today's climate, that the facts matter and scientific research is the best way to understand what, why, when, and how things are happening. But biology is messy. And to me, when I think about produce safety, I think about it as a confluence between plants, microorganisms, humans, and all of these things are impacted by their environment, physical spaces, chemical reactions. So it's a pretty complex thing. And thinking about the different places where we grow produce, the different people that are growing produce, the different produce that we're growing, understanding the challenges is an enormous task. But when we think about solving problems, it becomes exponentially bigger. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in each of these slides. You're going to hear this now and you're going to hear it at the end. Working together is the key to making progress forward. It really requires all of us with our different expertise and our different perspectives to share and to move together where we are constantly looking at risks, reducing risks, and working to provide fresh produce essentially to the world. The importance of the produce safety work really hinges on the fact that fruit and vegetable consumption reduces the risks of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, obesity, certain cancers. And the data tells us more consumption equals more benefits. All right. And here's something I think about a lot: providing access to fresh produce to all consumers. We know there are challenges with people in urban areas, rural areas. Certainly, when we saw things like COVID happen where we couldn't get distribution, many of us didn't have access to what we wanted. It also really impacts the economic viability of farms and rural communities. I can't not think about that when I work with farmers and I work with people who are struggling to keep a farm moving forward. And it provides this option of fresh consumption. This might, again, be a little tough for people to hear, but we could only eat cooked produce if we had to. And I think the deal is not all, many of us enjoy fresh salads and fresh produce. And there's a lot of delight and satisfaction that comes from eating fresh produce. So we want that option. We don't want the risk to be to the point where we're afraid to consume fresh. So I think that's when I think about the importance of what I do and what we all do collectively, those are things that come to mind. The other thing that's really important is looking at balancing these different demands. And this conversation is not just about produce safety, right? We have consumers that put demands on growers that are not always related to food safety. They want things without chemical sprays. They want things produced in a certain way. They want things presented in a certain way. And that is a demand on a lot of growers. The buyer's demand: third-party audits, food safety plans, industry standards such as LGMA or Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, cantaloupe growing guides, papaya growing requirements, and many other commodity requirements. We look at regulations, the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Other states have had regulations. We also then have to add in environmental co-management, sustainability, worker protection. All of these things are definitely part of our lives and very important. And here's the thing: it's a perishable product, oftentimes with very small margins that require managing pest, weather, market changes, labor shortages. All of these things are in this mix. So it's not just about putting on our produce safety tunnel vision goggles and moving forward. We have to think about produce safety in the midst of all these other things. I also think when we look at produce safety, one of the things that has been very difficult when we look at the research is public health expectations. There are no standards for public health expectations for safety when using agricultural water. In other areas, such as recreational water, there are guidelines based on testing that acknowledge some risk. Some research, if you dig in there, they try to calculate public health risks related to water use, usually specific to the organism based on testing. But these risk-based standards require that epidemiological data, and that doesn't exist for egg water uses. So that is one thing that I think is challenging when we look at research and when we try to set up projects to determine if what we're proposing in terms of practice is going to get to where we need to be in terms of public health expectations. I'm jumping off here because this really influenced what I put together for you today. Starting in December of last year, the PSA started offering revised Subpart E update webinars. How did we do this? We emailed all of the folks that had ever taken a PSA grower training course who we had emails for. And we said, hey, we need you to know there's a new Subpart E that was released in May, and we want to give you an update. We asked a question, were you aware that Subpart E had changed? And this really caught us by surprise. When we asked this question, 35% of people that identified as grower operator overall said they were aware. Okay, that means roughly are not aware. You can see in the purple and in the orange, we broke it out into English language and Spanish language because 7 of these webinars today have been offered in English and 5 have been offered in Spanish. And you can see here that from the farm operator owner perspective, the percentages are pretty darn close. When we move to those who identified as a farm worker, you can see 40% said they were aware. And that you do see 45% in English, 34% in Spanish. There's a variation there when you break that out into the languages. But again, that means 60 of them are not aware that there was a new Subpart E. When we look at the produce industry, about 50% more of the English speakers were aware than the Spanish. But again, if we look at that industry number as a whole, that 52.7%, it gets more interesting when we look at extension educators. 61% are aware. Okay, that's better. That's almost double of the growers, but still that leaves 40% of the people who attended these webinars were not aware. And lastly, when we asked if they were a government employee, you can see they had the highest overall with 63.9, but still a concerning number of people were not aware. That influenced the slides I put in, and we will be going over just a snippet of what's in that new rule at the very beginning, just to get everybody on the same page, or to ensure everybody's on the same page. What are the impacts of the lack of awareness? And this, from an extension standpoint, from somebody who spends their time trying to help growers understand and implement changes, I wanted to discuss what I think that importance is. The challenges extend to all of us working in produce and to the relevance of the science that we're sharing because the requirements now are different. And so depending on what you think the requirements are, you might look at different science to help guide your implementation. We initially intended to spend that hour and a half, 2 hours, spending time teaching people how to implement the new requirements. But instead, we switched back to telling them what the new requirements were. Most participants in these trainings had their TRIAS PSA training before the new part. So that's important to understand. And this lack of awareness among technical support people is notable because if they don't know that things have changed, they might be offering advice to growers that isn't actually based in the new requirements. And here's the thing, that short implementation window is a really big challenge. And what do I mean by that? For those of you that do know about the new Subpart E, you will know that April 7th of this year is when the first group will be subject to that rule. I think many states are going to not go forward with compliance inspections, but they're going to do educational ones. But it still puts us in this very short time frame that I think is really relevant. This is moving into those very specific requirements of the new pre-harvest rule. If you're not aware of it or you want to use that QR code, you can. That will take you to the new Subpart E, which was released in May 6th of 2024. Importantly, you can see in the purple here, it moves from a reliance on testing pre-harvest water for decision-making to an agricultural water assessment of the whole system. Again, moving from that MWQP, that microbial water quality profile requirement, to this requirement for an agricultural water assessment. The expectation is that growers understand their water quality, how their management practices minimize the risk, and that they can communicate that information to an inspector to make it clear why they've made the decisions they've made. And again, that's a little different than handing them your MWQP and saying, see, my water meets this requirement. I think that's a higher bar. I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea that we moved away from the MWQP because there were concerns about how science-based that was and how it actually was put together. But the issue is it does change the conversation and the expectation. Going back to helpful definitions, and I do want to cover this because it comes up so often. When we talk about agricultural water, first off, growers need to know if they're using agricultural water. Why is that important? Because the word agricultural water. Most growers, if you say you use water, it's all agricultural water. But in this case, the PSR has a very specific definition of what ag water is. So it's agricultural water used in covered activities on covered produce. Again, not produce under cover, not greenhouse produce, not high tunnels, not low tunnels. We do have that confusion often. Covered produce is that produce that is subject to the rule, where water is intended to or likely to. Very important phrase, intended to or likely to contact covered produce or food contact surfaces. Okay, so this is going to cover both pre-harvest and post-harvest water, covered produce and food contact surface. Again, that covered produce is that produce that is subject to the rule, and it refers to the harvested or harvestable part of the crop. Those of you that have seen some of these slides, I like to ask things like, is this ag water? This one's pretty clear. Lettuce is a covered crop. That's an overhead irrigation. That is going to be agricultural water because it is intended to contact that produce. This one is blackberries with drip irrigation. And here you can see the drip irrigation is actually shoved into the pot. This one I would not say is agricultural water. It's not intended to, it's not likely to contact those blackberries that are growing on that plant. But I purposefully added this one because you can see here, this is a drip irrigation under plastic, but there are holes in that plastic. And depending on how much water goes on these crops, depending on for how long, you can see it's pretty sandy, so it might drain well. But this is one where I would suspect the answer is yes, this is ag water. If you were out there and you knew it wouldn't touch those strawberries, then that would be not ag water. But this is one where I would say, yeah, this is likely to contact strawberries. Is this ag water? Carrots with drip irrigation. Carrots are, of course, a covered crop. That's drip irrigation, but it is going in the ground and contacting those carrots. Apples using spray mix tanks. I like to talk about this one because years ago I had a conversation with an apple grower and they were like, oh, good, this isn't going to impact us because we have this irrigation that is not going to contact the apples. And then I asked the question of, where are you mixing your sprays from? And they were mixing the sprays from a pond. So yes, that is ag water because it will be touching the apples if any time bloom or after would be agricultural water. This one, Love this one. Love this one because I love the conversations that happen. Here you have a living lettuce, which means it's harvested with roots on, and you can see here's the float that it's coming out of. Lots of discussions about ag water, pre-harvest ag water, post-harvest ag water. I would say in most cases, this is going to be actually post-harvest ag water as well. Most times when I've seen a living lettuce in the store, that water is definitely coming out of where the roots are stored and touching the harvestable part of we can have lots of discussions about it, but that one I would definitely say is ag water. This one we put in because the PSA team had a lot of thought about making sure we highlight also food contact surfaces. So here you can see this is an avocado packing line. Cleaning, that is a food contact surface, and so would be agricultural water. I just flipped through those quickly because these I think are very meaningful when we work with people to, again, highlight the first thing you need to do. First thing is determine if you're using agricultural water. Because if you are not using agricultural water, then the rest of this stuff is not applicable to what you're doing. So that's important. Always like to share the language that all agricultural water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, and that this is the standard in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, and it applies to both pre-harvest and post-harvest water. So you can see we're wading in a little deeper here. One of the requirements is that growers do an agricultural water systems inspection. And this has to be done for all water sources and distribution systems at least annually. They have to keep these areas free of debris, trash, domesticated animals, and other hazards. We recommend at this juncture that growers map their distribution system just to help them understand what they are trying to look at and what they are trying to inspect. This is because water can be contaminated and it can spread that contamination. I think everybody understands that, and that is widely accepted as a risk. When it comes to the ag water systems inspection, again, it applies to both pre-harvest and post-harvest water. You have to look at the location and nature of the water source. So we're going to talk in a moment about those different water sources. Surface water we look at as higher risk than municipal water, which we put at the other end as lower risk. And groundwater usually falls somewhere in the middle, depending on how that groundwater is captured and protected and the source of that groundwater. We look at distribution systems. Are they open canals? Are they piped? Are those pipes clean? What does that look like? Again, high variability across the industry. So this is why growers have to look at their own systems. And then the degree of protection from possible sources of contamination, looking at adjacent land, biological soil amendments of animal origin, and wildlife. Importantly, all of these things will influence agricultural water assessment. What's the difference? This is really important, and I just want to drive really one thing home here. These are two different things, and as far as FDA is concerned, they should have two different records. And that's the part I really want to drive home. You will use the ag water systems inspection as part of the ag water assessment, but they are two different things and they require two different records. That's just really important. When we look at the ag water assessment, there are key requirements there. You have to identify conditions that are likely to introduce hazards to the covered produce or food contact surfaces. Has to be done at the beginning of the season, at least annually. Reassessed when there's a significant change. So determining when that significant change is important. And they have to be written, reviewed, dated, and signed in a reasonable time by the supervisor or responsible party. That's, again, very quick overview of that. When we look at the exemptions, here's really important things to cover. You could be exempt from having to do a pre-harvest ag water assessment if you are using the same quality water as harvest or post-harvest ag water. That could be a municipal, as long as it has no detectable generic E. coli and meets other post-harvest water testing requirements. So it's been using the testing that's required. You cannot use untreated surface water, even if it has no detectable generic E. coli. You can use water that's received from a public water system or that's treated in accordance with the FSMA PSR. Very important last points. Reasonably likely the water quality will not change prior to the use, and that each exemption condition requires a supporting record, right? So if you're going to use the exemption, that's it. Okay, so two things. Is it ag water? Yes or no. If it's not ag water, don't have to do it. If it is ag water and you want this exemption, here's what you have to do. Okay, diving more into the elements so we can get to talking more about the science. This ag water assessment must evaluate the ag water system, which we already talked about, agricultural water use practices, crop characteristics, environmental conditions, and other relevant factors where we're going to talk about testing there specifically. The other thing, again, is identifying those conditions that are reasonably likely. And the orange box here is growers must make a determination as to whether they need to take measures to reduce risks. And that's the important part. It's not just the assessment, but actually making a decision at the end of if you're required to do any corrective or mitigation measures. Is testing required? Okay, this should have been purple. I apologize. I should have put a Q and a purple here. Somebody asked this question in the registration. No, testing for pre-harvest water is not a requirement of their new rule. Again, moving away from that MWQP. Importantly, and you're going to hear this multiple times, water tests provide information about that pre-harvest water quality. And I recommend to growers, even if they're not required to test, that they do test their pre-harvest agricultural water because I think it is very valuable. Water tests are required for ag water used during harvest and post-harvest. And if that is touching food contact surfaces, water for washing hands, ice, water for washing equipment. I'm guessing whoever does the March one will be talking about those requirements. But that has to have no detectable generic E. coli in a 100 ml sample. So no water testing is required for pre-harvest water. But if we go back to that slide where we were talking about if you have a well that you want to test to be exempt, then you would have to test for that. All right. Somebody else asked, what is an acceptable level of generic E. coli in pre-harvest water? This is a really difficult question to answer from a science standpoint. When it comes to the rule, the FDA did say you could continue to use the information provided for the MWQP. Again, the science of that, I think, is an interesting discussion, but you are, as far as the PSR is concerned, allowed to use that. If you are asking, I pulled a water sample and I got something that's over that 126. Can I use this water? That's where you have to lean on looking at the other parts of your ag water assessment to make that determination. There is no cutoff when it comes to what is acceptable. So that's important when you have to think more about the science that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes here. And hopefully that will give you some insight as to whether or not that is meeting your quality expectations that you're comfortable accepting when you use that water. Sources. Surface water is higher risk. We talked about that. Importantly, not all surface water, when we look at the science, is the same. Running water can be much more variable, typically is much more variable in water quality. If you're going to test it, it becomes less dependable because it changes very frequently. Ponds are usually more consistent, but are subject to contamination events such as animal intrusion, human impacts. It can change seasonally. I've seen ponds be contaminated by accidents on the farm, effluent pipes that have busted and run into there. So that's the thing you have to think about when you're looking at that source water. Groundwater can be impacted by well-designed capture system, cracked caps, lack of backflow devices. So if you're going to be testing your groundwater, you have to pay attention to all of these things when making that assessment. Somebody asked a question about rainwater capture. Digging up information out of the PSR, it's mentioned 3 times in the 2024 preamble. That response says essentially captured rainwater is ag water if it is used to contact the harvestable portion of the crop. And so if you're going to use it, you definitely need to include it as part of your assessment. Distribution systems, open systems, higher risk. Why? Because they're open to animals and other runoff risk, working with neighbors to reduce contamination risk. We're going to talk, the next slide is really going to talk about some science that is there, but sometimes it is very difficult to work with your neighbors. A lot of times this is going to come down to uh, right to farm rules, right? When we look at risks that come from some animal operations that can negatively impact our produce operations. Properly maintained or closed systems are typically lower risk. They have to be properly constructed. The big thing here is removing hazards if they're seasonally used. When I think about it, the metal pipes that people are using, cleaning out those metal pipes, making sure no rodents, snakes, frogs. I've seen those things in these pipes when they get screwed together and they get pushed through the line. Oftentimes they'll cause problem with water flow. You want to minimize the pooling water in the system. So when we see the pipes that dip like that and we get water, there is some research that talks about the risks from having that pooling water and understanding things that can increase risk, such as sand filters if they're not well maintained, or if things build up in the sand filters that then between the source water and the use can add a level of contamination. Ag water systems and talking about adjacent land and animals. We do know that adjacent land and animals can impact risk, but there's many variables that need to be assessed. And boy, it changes based on who and what is in that adjacent land. So here's several publications that I used, plus one that's not up here that Spence et al. That I looked at. And so we know things like if the animals that are next to you are grazing on grass or some sort of vegetation, that the risk of runoff and blow off is lower. If you look at animals that are on dry soils or a feedlot, you'll see in the literature that contamination, STEC, can blow in the wind quite far distances to contact in dust particles that contaminates fields, can contaminate waterways. There are, when we look at outbreaks on adjacent land, there's many outbreaks where adjacent land is implicated as being a cause of the outbreak. Sometimes it's very tough to find the organism in that adjacent land on the crop, but we do know from research, Elaine Berry, certainly China Rock, this publication, we do know it can blow into these environments and take pathogens with it. So you have to consider, who are your neighbors? What are those neighbors? What is the land like? What's the slope? What's the distance? What's the wind? All of those are very important things when we talk about risks and look at the literature based on risks associated with adjacent land and animals. I also want to point out that there were a couple of publications talking about birds, and both of them essentially came down to saying birds were not as big of a concern as they initially thought. Certainly the research from the Southwest Agricultural Regional Environment Microbiology Study looked at red-winged blackbirds, came up positive. That Spence paper talked about birds and different levels of fecal contamination, if they're songbirds versus other birds that have different sizes of poop. But it was very interesting to look at the literature related to birds. Certainly, we don't want to harvest anything that has bird poop on it, but looking at the overall risk, it was interesting to read about where they feel the risk from birds is at currently. And I say that very carefully because there was an outbreak in Alaska related to cranes. So obviously, birds can cause risks, but we have to think about what kind of bird it is, how many birds there are, and the type of bird. Okay, ag water use practices. Human pathogens can survive and be distributed. There's no debate about that through contaminated water. We do use water in a lot of ways on farms, but the irrigation method matters. As we showed in those first slides talking about overhead, subsurface, here you have subsurface furrow sprinkler. Subsurface is going to be very low risk because it's usually right at the root line, unless the root is a carrot. but furrow, more likely to have risks associated with it. And then sprinkler, of course, being a higher risk. And modifying these practices to reduce contact with the harvestable portion is going to reduce the risk. I think that's pretty well understood and accepted. Extending the time, though, time is your, I'm going to say, inconsistent friend. That's why I made it the title of this. There are many things besides time that are going to influence the ability to see that die off. It's going to be dependent on things like your irrigation method, which I just mentioned, the microorganisms. Some microorganisms are going to die off faster. The crop. Interestingly, there's a paper looking at spinach and lettuce, both leafy greens, but the die off rate is different. Lettuce died off faster in this paper than spinach. Relative humidity. This paper right here, I'm going to mess up the name, Bellius in 2020. This paper right here talked about the impact of relative humidity. And I put this quote in here that a single die-off rate for estimating time to harvest intervals across different weather conditions, produce types, and bacteria should be revised. Because of the variation they're seeing, that was their recommendation. So I thought that was a very concise way to share that outcome. So again, die-off does happen, that in the literature, but it is dependent on many more things than just time. Die-off as a mitigation measure, again, is allowed in the produce safety rule, but you will see here that it had these caveats when conditions on the farm match the conditions that were evaluated. I say this to growers all the time. Just because it's allowed doesn't mean it's a good idea. I would say that the die-off that is in the rule, half day, half log die-off per day for up to 4 days, is a very generous die-off rate. And if I were a grower, depending on the commodity, I'm not sure I would feel comfortable depending on that die-off rate, looking at the other literature that's out there. When there is a long time, months, weeks to months before harvest, calculations based on water test results may not be needed. That is out of the rule. Okay. Crop characteristics, physical plant characteristics definitely influence bacterial contamination. I'm going to give a shout out to Don because he's like, you really need to put pictures on this to demonstrate what we're talking about here. Remember, we grow a lot of different commodities. Cantaloupe, certainly, leafy greens, strawberries, they all have different surfaces. Lots of very interesting research out there looking at sometimes I'm going to talk about this in a moment, in other areas of study, but looking at how wettable are produce crops? How much does water adhere to them? And is that water, if that water is carrying contamination, how likely is it going to be that it will stick to these surfaces? When, again, you look at this paper, Thomas et al. 2024, very interesting research looking at crops having different potential for adhering bacteria, even different within the same crop type have different potential for adhering bacteria. So think about that for a sec. We're not just talking about lettuces. We're now talking about what lettuce cultivar are you growing? That's an interesting thing. The plants respond to human and plant pathogen presence. We know plants are really great at sensing they're being chewed on or they're being attacked, and they oftentimes can respond in ways to try and minimize the impact to their survival by doing that. Remember, plants can't run away, so they've developed all of these defense mechanisms. It turns out, though, that different serivars of bacteria differ in their ability to adhere to crops. We're talking about different serivars of the same salmonella, or not the same salmonella, but different serivars and their ability to attach. So this complexity is immense. And the research, again, is fascinating, but very complex. And the interaction of bacteria in the plant surface involves attachment, survival, colonization, and then internalization. So a lot has to happen. And all of these things make it more difficult if you look at the research that's out there. And when you think about what our farmers are doing, different commodities, different cultivars, this becomes very difficult to look at the literature and help it guide decision making. Other things, when we look at crop characteristics research, again, there are 99 crops. I've shown this slide once before in another presentation, but there are 99 crops in the Ag Water Assessment Builder tool. There are not research on all of those crops. And as I just mentioned, some of the research focuses on cultivars. So not just lettuce, but what cultivar of lettuce are you using? There is information on crop growth near the ground, staked on a tree, what happens at different stages, the texture, the shape, the strength of the epidural layer. Again, things that are hard to determine maybe at the farm level, but that there is good research on, and the growth stage that impacts internalization. Again, there are crops with a significant amount of research. There's a fair bit on tomatoes, a fair bit on cantaloupe, but there's these intricacies that I think we need to be aware of when we look at the research. What are the challenges there then? So beyond not having enough crop specific research, there's lots of different microorganisms that have been associated with outbreaks. I've been talking right now about bacteria. And when I put together this slide, I had a lot of goals to discuss, especially when we think about this science and how it impacts fruit and vegetable production. First, we need to keep in mind that norovirus, which I have not mentioned up until this point, is the leading cause of fruit and vegetable contamination. Just want to return to the idea that, again, lots of different microorganisms, not just bacterial. Second, when I pulled this quote from this Peterson paper, it highlighted a few things for me. First of all, it highlighted the different crops that we've been talking about. In this case, they're highlighting lettuce and carrots. But I love the discussion about the experimental method and looking at the impact that experimental method might be having. We've certainly seen this type of discussion when researchers discuss cyclospora research and other microorganisms of concern in fresh produce. And I added a line in here. I'm going to give Donna credit for this because many growers are growing lots of different commodities on their farms. And if you look at the preamble, comment 66, it does discuss growers being allowed when they're doing their risk assessment to group commodities when they're assessing risk. But based on the research and based on where the research seems to be going, it'll be interesting in the long run to see if things like the risk of adhesion and the commodity type end up aligning with how we group commodities when we think about growing. Again, I'm very impacted by the fact that different cultivars have different adhesion potential. And it gets into the weeds a little bit, but I think it's important to think about when we look at where we might be going with research. And can't help but think about the usefulness to growers conducting an ag water assessment. I asked some colleagues to tell me what's their favorite paper, which ones do you think are really relevant? And I got this back from a colleague, and I didn't get her permission to say her name, so I won't. But I wouldn't send a grower a research paper. I loved that. I love that. Why wouldn't we send a grower a research paper? Because most of the growers are going to look at it and be like, what am I supposed to do with this? They may not understand the research, but it might just not be what they're looking for. So this research surrounding crop characteristics, adhesion, and internalization is very interesting. I would say it's fascinating. But when I look at the usefulness to particular growers, it would have to be a very specific instance where we knew a lot about what they were doing. We knew there was a particular risk from a particular organism in a particular crop or even cultivar they're growing, then it might be really helpful. Otherwise, we're forced to move up to that 10,000 foot level and give them generalities, which are valuable. I just want to make it clear that at that point, we're making an extrapolation. And that's the important point I want to make. So, research from related fields. This is one paper and I didn't put it up here, so I apologize. This is Gaskin 2005, looking at droplet adhesion or wetting based on increasing the efficacy of protective sprays. This one really struck me because it might be useful to say, oh, if you grow a crop that is not easily wetted, then maybe overhead irrigation isn't such a risk because it's less likely to attach to the crop. Whereas if you're making decisions about mixing sprays that have those surfactants that make those sprays stick better, maybe you don't want to mix that spray tank with poor water quality because now you've taken commodity that if you just apply water to doesn't stick. But if you add that surfactant, now you actually might be helping those organisms attach to that commodity. And again, that overlap between crop characteristic and water use, we might be finding insightful things from other related fields looking at things like crop protective sprays. Environmental conditions. Okay, we all know the climate is changing and it's impacting climatic factors, including temperature, relative humidity, precipitation, UV radiation. I mentioned a few slides back that things like relative humidity are impacting whether or not microorganisms survive once they're on the crop. Extreme weather patterns can increase produce safety risks, whether we've got flooding, hail that can damage the crop and make it more susceptible to contamination, frost and scalding temperatures that sometimes require us to use additional water, additional agricultural water to minimize the impact to the crop, to save a crop even, can also lead to damage of the crop. So we've talked about that significant impact of pathogen presence and survival, different areas, different impacts. When we look at solar radiation, decreases survivorship of human pathogens, that lower relative humidity, which I've now mentioned 3 times. Rain events typically contribute to contamination of those running water sources. So again, you have a large rain event, it will usually push contamination into streams, into canals. And here's the weird thing about that. People will say, if I just got a lot of rain, I'm probably not pulling water from my irrigation canal, right? Because my crop just got wetted by rain. But what we're seeing in some of the water distribution is that rain is not distributed equally across in a region or an area. So you will have one area very close regionally to an area that will get 2 inches of rain, and not far away, they will get no rain. So they may still be trying to pull water from that water source, and that runoff into the water source can bring with it more contamination and create the risks for the folks that are using that water. And again, this paper from Weller et al. Talking about those interactions between weather, microbial, and physiochemical water quality impacts is a good paper that discusses that. Other characteristics when we talk about testing water, water tests can be part of an ag water assessment. Again, I believe wholeheartedly growers should test their water. Just know it is not required. That's the key thing. If testing, let me stop here. Get everybody's attention. If testing is required for a third-party audit, growers need to continue testing. This is an area where we have had a lot of problems. And the reason we've had problems is because words matter and we sometimes mix them up. People will say inspection when they mean audit, or they'll say audit when they mean inspection. And when we run into that, we sometimes will see people giving growers the wrong advice. Water testing is not required for the Produce Safety Rule Subpart E. So water testing is not required for your inspection. If you are getting an audit, most of the audits require testing your agricultural water. So if you are doing an audit to stay in the marketplace, the growers must keep testing that water. And I just want to stop here because this has caused a lot of agony for many people. Test results, importantly for the rule, cannot be the only basis for making your water use decisions. So you cannot say, oh, I went ahead, even though it's not required, and built an MWQP. I want to use that as a justification. You cannot do that. You still have to walk through all the sections we've talked about in the ag water assessment and do an ag water assessment. Again, testing might be necessary for that exemption for ag water. So I say it's not required, but not required unless you are going to try and get that exemption, specifically if you're using it for groundwater. If your water comes from a municipality, you can get a copy of their test results or a copy of their compliance paperwork. Yep. One more slide on testing. Just want to highlight that if you do a generic E. coli test, that is going to tell you the likelihood of fecal contamination in your water. Fecal contamination is not always associated with pathogens, but it is a good way to know if things are happening in your water. The larger the volume of water, the more likely you are to find things, but this is usually not what growers do. They usually take a liter or less of a water sample because they don't have the same access to the tools, but still a water test is valuable. Again, not required by the regulation. Okay. So here's the thing. After growers do that ag water assessment, they must make a determination. And you can see here, this is straight out of the FDA materials. They have to decide, is the ag water not safe or of adequate sanitary quality? Are there conditions on adjacent or nearby land that pose risks that are related to animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, and human waste? Or are there other conditions that may introduce known or reasonably foreseeable hazards not related to those things? Or are there no known or reasonably foreseeable hazards for which mitigation is necessary? Growers need to make that determination. If they determine they fit into the red, orange, or yellow categories, they will have to then implement a mitigation measure. And I'm not going to focus on this because I want to get to other things with the remaining time. But again, I just want to make it clear, have to make that determination. If it falls into one of these categories, they have to do things. Now, I will say that a lot of what we talked about, using die-off, changing your water application methods, those things are all appear in these corrective and mitigation measures. So you can use the science that we've just talked about to influence your decision about what you're going to do if you need a corrective measure or a mitigation measure. There's always this ability to take alternative mitigation measures if they're supported by the research science. So there are tools that the PSA tools and resources. We do have this QR code will take you to our updated required records fact sheet. And it includes a new agricultural water assessment template. It has an updated agricultural water systems inspection template. I think one of the important things about the ag water assessment template that we tried to do is we tried to pull in not just the requirements of Subpart E, which is what I've been talking about today, but also to include those requirements that are relevant to water that come from S and other subsections of the rule. So that's important. We are having more update webinars. There's new emails have gone out this time. We included the trainers. The next slide will tell you the date that went out. There is an option for lead trainers to offer updates and certificates if there's interest. So far, we haven't had much interest. So I think if there is an interest, you should let us know. We are updating our fact sheet supplemental slides and educators calls information to cover all of the new things that have happened since the new Subpart E. I do want to highlight the sanitizer tool. This has been Donna's baby for a long time, but definitely gets input from the entire team. That has come up because of the option of treating water. And growers have asked, what can I use to treat? What is labeled for treatment? So that sanitizer tool is really helpful for that information. Okay, more Subpart E webinars. If you want to go over If you're thinking, wow, that went too fast and I really don't even know what's in Subpart E, you can attend a Subpart E webinar. If you have been trained by us in the past, that email went out to you January 23rd at noon Eastern Standard Time. If you look in your email for Produce Safety Alliance, you will find the registration links there. Here are the dates that they are coming. We also have a new on-demand video option. It doesn't have the Q&A. These sessions are 2 hours long. The second hour is all Q&A, all rapid fire, and very interactive. And the important thing that Donna wanted me to remind you about is that if you participate in these webinars or view the on-demand, you can receive an email certificate of completion. Growers have asked us, trainers have asked us, can you make a certificate so that people can say, I attended this and I'm aware of this. So we went ahead and did that. There are lots of other tools, and I will say that there's many more than are on this, but I picked a few. IFPA has an industry guidance document for pre-harvest agricultural water. It is being revised to incorporate some revisions, and I expect that new version will be up, but here's a link to the current version. Don really wanted me to highlight the 2015 and 2024 preamble to the Produce Safety Rule. Very important for providing context for expectations and understanding. I will say that we at the PSA are constantly returning to that, scanning it for questions that people are asking us because it does provide guidance. We do not have complete guidance yet for the new Subpart E, so it's important to look at the preamble for that information. And also, there is the FDA Ag Water Assessment Builder. Here's what the builder is good at. The builder is good at highlighting the areas you need to assess. So if a grower is really not sure where to start and wants to do a step-by-step walkthrough, the assessment builder is good at that. What the builder is not good at doing is putting up red flags when you put in something that is very risky. It will not help you identify where those risks are at. And so it's got good parts, it's got weaknesses, like all of us. But I just want to make that clear. It is a good resource, but understand what it can do for you. Here's getting to the end. Work on progress, don't expect perfection. That's really important for what we're trying to do here. We can't wait to move forward. Can't wait till we have all the research we need to make these decisions. We aren't going to see, we don't anticipate anyway, that we're going to release guidance before the compliance dates in April. We anticipate many states, I've talked to several states, are going to use educational visits in that first year like they've done so often, but we have to move forward. Use the science we have, use the expertise we have. It is really important that we all work together on this, focus on that research that is relevant and meaningful, right? What is helping you make those determinations? That basic research is so necessary, but not always hugely applicable to certain environments. So again, sometimes you're going to have to make extrapolations from that to get to a field environment to help a grower or for growers to make that determination. I added this one specifically based on some comments Donna had made. Grower expertise is relevant and impactful. We have been working with growers on helping them do these ag water assessments. And what's interesting is the decisions they're making and the way they're making decisions based on economics, based on number of, say, wells or ag water systems that they have on their farm. So check your assumptions at the door. And when you work with growers, listen to what they're trying to tell you and what they're trying to do, because we find that if you give growers the information, they will make these decisions based on lots of those parameters that we talked about early on, that I talked about, right? It's not just about produce safety. It's about market. It's about moving produce. It's about buyers, and they're making really good decisions. But I just want to highlight that. Focus on those priority risks, not the multitude of hazards. Overloading growers at this point would be counterproductive. We are not ever going to be able to address every hazard. We have to focus on those high level. My real fear is that growers are going to overlook the obvious, looking for the obscure. There's always going to be risk. There's a paper I meant to add in here and I didn't, but there's always going to be risk. We are never going to get to zero. It's not going to happen. So let's get rid of the biggest risks first and then work steadily on always looking at continuous improvement. Things I ponder and that concern me. Is it reasonable to ask growers to gain access to the research, read it, understand it, and make decisions based upon it? Possibly. But not all research is accessible. That's in two ways. Well, some research is firewalled. I was very excited in prepping for this presentation to see how many journals are now open access. It was amazing. It really was amazing to see how many journals are open access. So that part is being addressed. But there's a lot of details in research that I myself was looking up these protocols and looking up these processes because they were unfamiliar to me. I spend most of my life in extension, not doing research, but it takes time to understand the protocols, the processes, and to determine if the research is really applicable to what you're doing. Not all growers have the necessary background. Not all the technical support people have the necessary background. And it's important when we know that we're going to have growers interfacing with inspectors, we want that conversation to be productive and not frustrating and not in conflict. So that's important to consider. There aren't enough people to provide technical assistance to support growers, regulators, and others making decisions. That's just a fact. And I think that's something that troubles me a lot when I think about it. So again, working together is important. Here, what I think is a realistic view. There is research available to help guide decision-making. Hopefully today I've given you something to think about. Research is often very specific to location, crop, pathogen, or environment. Growers are going to have to understand which is relevant to their farm. And some growers are not going to have that information. They're going to have to make an extrapolation from something close because it's not going to be specific. Research uses tools and methods that can be uncommon or expensive. Growers don't have access to the same things. And growers are going to have to make some assumptions when making their assessment. And inspectors are going to have to understand those assumptions and understand in that conversation what they can do. Final thoughts. There's no unique preventative measure. I took this or intervention strategy that could be applied at one point of the food chain. It's absolutely critical that we communicate and work together as we move forward. Why is that? That's because consistency is important. Yes, there are differences in region, in crop, in commodity, in pathogen, but communicating consistently will help us avoid unnecessary conflicts and confusion. And it's important because we will all have that goal of produce safety. Our numbers are low. We need each other. And here's the last thing. Don't take your eyes off. Don't take your eyes off the real goals. Ensuring safe and abundant supply of fresh produce is the goal. Fruits and vegetables, making them abundant, providing that research and technical assistance to support effective practices, and helping growers remain economically viable in the marketplace. Keep them growing produce. We want to make that happen for ourselves and for national security, for our health, for all of those reasons. I'm going to wrap up by giving a huge shout out to the PSA team. These people are top notch at every turn. I just got an email from a grower giving me feedback on one of the people he had recently interacted with. It's amazing. Almost made me cry, I will say, but can't say enough about the team and what they do to keep things moving forward and to serve growers. I do want to give my thanks to these colleagues for input. Last minute, I was asking people for things, so I really do appreciate them taking the time to respond to me.